I'm Adrianna. It's nice to see everyone today. I haven't done a talk in a very long time, so I got a little bit of jitters. Please stay patient with me. So I work at Sales Loft. It's a sales engagement tool, mainly for like account executives, SDRs, people who sell a product and need to keep track of all their leads, opportunities, companies they talk to. I work on the Dos Equis team, but also they're just CM integrations. We just do really great, funny names. And so what we do is we handle how the data goes back and forth between our platform and the different CRMs we work with, which are Salesforce, Microsoft Dynamics, and most recently we've been finalizing HubSpot. So as you can see, there's a picture of Marge, and there's words that says Aries Moon. Aside from being a UI engineer, I'm also an astrologer. So I like to find patterns in code, but I also like to find patterns in the universe using astrology. I've been studying astrology for about 10 years, so that's like the other side of me. Aries moon is just my moon sign. It's just who I am internally. So if you know anything about astrology, I'd love to talk to anybody about it. But I know this is a tech conference, but I just wanted to introduce that. That's another part of me that is good to know about. I have a 9-year-old boy. He's been 9 for a really long time. He's growing up really quickly. I have a cat named Silver, and I love plants. I have like a million hobbies. Kind of hard to pin down what I'm really interested in, but the good thing is I have a good career to support all that. So I'm gonna give you a breakdown what we're gonna talk about. Does everybody in this room know what domain-driven design is? If you can raise your hand. Okay, we've got a few people. So okay, I really like that there are less people who know about it because it's really like a basic level trying to understand what domain-driven design is and just how to apply it to React. It's been around for a while. It's not a new concept. And so we're going to talk about my personal project that I led with my team. They kind of gave me the ability to like make decisions on how we were going to build things. But I didn't really know about domain-driven design. Our architecture is in our company is built pretty much with domain entities, domain concepts and stuff. So I'm going to talk about my personal project. We're going to talk about what domain-driven design is, how to apply it to React, and then we're going to tie it back to my personal project so that you kind of see an example of knowing something probably that you've already worked on that probably has all these principles applied to it already. We may get to 5, but I didn't really get to flesh that out as good. And I'm also giving a talk at Refactor Tech. If anybody is going to Refactor Tech this week, it's on Friday. Tickets are already sold out. But if you can make it next year, there's always a new one next year stuff. So I'm doing a talk about the joy of TypeScript, and I tie in domain-driven design into it and how TypeScript actually is really beneficial for it. All right, cool. We're gonna go into my personal project, what we worked on. So a lot of the projects at SalesLoft currently right now for UI engineers are focused on deprecating Angular, and we were on Angular version 1. Very sadly, I don't know if you've ever had to play with version 1. It's nothing after version 2. It's nothing like it. So we had to modernize all of that into React. One of the projects that I got to lead is field configuration. These tasks were just so many of how many that I've had to consider when building out these new pages. And I will show you what these pages look like so you can put a visual to the concept I'm about to talk about. But essentially, these things were on top of my mind. I was not at all thinking about how I was going to build it. I was just going to follow existing patterns that are healthy patterns or practices in our current code base right now. And so since our code base was already gearing towards going towards domains, I was already thinking, how do I organize this in a way that makes most sense? And so I had to take a lot of duplicated code in Angular and see how I can turn that into React without doing the same services again, but conforming everything into one and in a more organized, readable, maintainable way. So these are just a list of things, and I still work on this page till today, and I have even more work to do. And the fact that I know this approach helps me even more to kind of make better decisions so that I don't have to go back and kind of think about like how to build it better, because I've already gotten to the point where I've built it in a scalable way. Okay, cool. So this is what it looks like today. As you can see, this is a table. We had to rebuild this. I wish I had screenshots of what it looked like before. It was kind of crazy looking, but we use kind of design system components already that are built in, and I just have to conform all the data to how I need it. So this is the table. This is just one part of it, and as you can see, person fields. I'm gonna use this little thingy right here. Count fields and opportunity fields. These are the subdomains of the field configuration domain that I had to refactor everything into. And so when we create a custom field, we go to just this form right here. This wasn't there before. It used to be like a modal that popped up, and then we had to make it a little bit more complex, and it gets even longer as you start making more changes to the form. So, and then this is just the process of what it looks like when you're editing an existing field. So these right here, if I go back to this, person, account, and opportunity, these are essentially sales loft object types, and these can be translated into the CRM to bring data back and forth based on whether an admin maps these fields, so that there's whatever data that they're updating on either the CRM or in the sales loft platform the data gets synced over based on whatever CRM fields they put in, which are these right here, against their sales loft fields. So that just gives you like a basic overview of the personal project I had to work on. And then we're gonna move past these. So this is kind of a breakdown of essentially everything that I kind of like brain dumped as to like how I organized it. Types are kind of the high level TypeScript types that I have. And TypeScript within this project became very helpful to try to keep everything clean and on the same page as to what I was working on. The internal packages were packages that I had to create from multiple servers that already existed, and I had to find the common patterns. And so all these services were created in order to start providing all the data to the components. The pink boxes are usually all the React components that existed today. And you're gonna see this image again, but after we do the domain-driven design concepts, and we're gonna tie it all together, and it's gonna be in a more organized way as to what is everything, or what is connected to all the building blocks within the approach. Damn, I didn't bring water, I'm thirsty now. Okay, so what is domain-driven design? You see, these are textbook concepts, but essentially it's an organized way of grouping a separation of concerns related to a specific area. I like to think of it as like how I clean a household when I've got different things I've got to put in different boxes. This is for this one, this is for that, and that does for that. Like based off of different actions, different things that you need, and you don't put things where they're not supposed to be. You know where they belong. So you have an organized way of looking at things. And so in the future, when you're making decisions, should I put this here, or does it make more sense to put it in the right place? Domain-driven design is a very organized way to structure your React application so that things aren't in places that they shouldn't be, and there isn't confusion in the future. Oh, thank you so much. This is like a really good image that I found on Google that kind of breaks down a good part of where we're gonna start talking about the building blocks of this approach. So kind of the meats and potatoes of this stuff is gonna be the entities and value objects. So entities are essentially the domain object that has an ID tied to it. It's essentially has properties that you can change on it, but it has its own identity. And they have mutability. And then the comparable one is value objects. Value objects actually don't change their state. The properties on them can change their state, but they don't equate to something with an identity. Aggregates are just pretty much the grouping of both entities and value objects. We'll talk more about how this conforms within components, because in components, you can apply these entities and value objects into them. And so they're just grouped data of these entity and value objects. And then factories. Factories are pretty much in charge of just creating the objects that you need. And sometimes the way that you use these factories, you kind of hide away the actions that are taken upon them. And so usually validation services, things like data structuring, things that you kind of don't want other people to be aware of what's happening in the background, these would be considered factories. And another thing to consider about factories and domain services, sometimes they can overlap and kind of interplay together because they might be dependent. So if you're creating an object, you'll need that, but you'll need like those API calls to kind of finish off the factory, and so you'll be dependent on both of these things. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. Sweet. So now we're going to talk about how we can apply this approach to React. So number one, common language. Between different teams or one team, we have our product manager, right? She has a major like overlook of how things are supposed to work. She kind of knows already the terms, the terminology that's needed, works with the designer, right, to provide the right words within the user experience. Your software architect is going to know a broader vision in regards to the code base of how everything works together. Full stack engineers are going to know how the back end works. And then the UI, as you're building out the UI and you're working on the React parts, you want things to mesh together so that everything makes sense when you guys are grooming tasking cards. So that common language of knowing the same thing between all the items is going to be very important, so that when you guys are trying to figure out bugs, trying to debug certain situations, you guys can communicate in one way of how everything works. Not everything is in different, like I'm talking in one way, and what I'm saying and within my code trying to read and trying to explain it to my product manager how I think this bug should be fixed in, it's all in one place. And one thing that really helps with common language is documentation. Documentation is really great, especially when you're like, when I was finalizing my project, I was working on documentation and everything got put together. It was like one big picture, finally got aha moment. And so it was probably a good idea to create that documentation of what words mean, how I use those words in the UI, and how those words are also used in the backend if there's any confusion. Sometimes there's a lot of overlap that you need to happen, but sometimes there's a lot of different meanings behind words that need to be defined before starting the project. Bounded context. So essentially, we want to, when you are creating these React components, you want to have separation of concerns between these components and which ones they do, and separating between having strong boundaries of where the state goes or how far it can be extended down the line for child components. And so essentially, you want to have a specific area related to that. Aggregate routes are probably a good way of defining your high-level services, like the services that get all the data for you and provide it all to the components. You want to separate those services. And then there's also the components that build up the larger component. So you have a high-level component that may have an entire form, but while the small-level components build the small building blocks of that form. Okay, so applying all these patterns. So the fact that we know what our building blocks of this approach is, entities and value objects, we can apply both these domain objects into the components by putting them together, by addressing to see if they fit together, or they need to work together to kind of like create a bigger picture within the React components. and then contextual domain logic. So essentially, if we're working within one domain, we understand that we don't step out unless it's required to step out of that domain, but we have context as to where certain situations, certain logic, domain logic, business logic has to exist within that domain. And so if I had to do something that was unrelated to field configuration, but I still needed that data, I wouldn't do it in that same spot. I would do it somewhere else and provide a new domain or a new subdomain. And testing is pretty simple. If we take this approach with domain-driven design, we have an easier way of testing certain use cases instead of going all over the place and testing things like that, and testing things that may not be relevant to what we're working on. Sweet. All right. Cool. So, let's see. So, essentially, this was the graphic we saw earlier today, and this puts together. It looks a little bit different. I had a couple iterations as I was learning the approach and trying to identify the different things that are already within the project that I was working on. And so essentially the types were very great at telling me what is going to be important of the building blocks. And so that's why TypeScript is going to be essential, I believe, into putting or building React applications, to give you a good idea of where those subdomains are going to start off, if you have any, and then where your entities and your value objects are. Now, in my entities, here I have a standard field and custom field. And so essentially, these are the building blocks of each subdomain in terms of these are the items that are going to be unique. They have an ID attached to them. These are the things that I go in to create or edit. And so the properties on them may change, but they will always be consistent. And then the value objects between the CRM field and the mapping, these are properties that belong to the entities. The other examples that include on value objects include like address, measurements, dates, so things like that. These are things that you can create new ones. You can change the properties on them, but essentially this is not the identity tied to the domain, the entities are. And so then comes the internal packages that I've built out. These provide the domain services. These are the services where I can either update data, send data back to the server for creating anything, and then providing that. Within these services, I have different layers where I'm transforming. These are not services, or I should say the layers are not things that I make public or let known for other developers to know how that data is conformed. They can look within the code base, and I do provide documentation as how it's built, but ideally it's not to be changed because it's all conformed to work within the entities. The data enrichment layer is just to provide any missing data based off of any data that's provided to me from the value objects. And the import requirements layer is just another additional factory that allows me to determine whether the entities need to provide a warning or anything. That goes more into depth into my specific project. So the shared pages and the separated pages are actually React components. So pretty much all the pink boxes and stuff. Depending on how you build your React components, your high level components are going to hold all your child components, and all that data is aggregated. And aggregates are clusters of entities and value objects. So I have all of these React components. The field configuration is what holds the pages that I showed earlier on the UI for the different subdomains, person, opportunity, and account. And so this one component, field configuration, holds just all these pages into one, and we separate, but all of that is clustered all together because it's unnecessary to create different ones. And I tell you that because I created different forms for every subdomain I had. That was the reason for me learning domain-driven design, because I had such a hard time kind of like conceptualizing or realizing it would have been better to have one parent component that holds all of this data. But there were some differences amongst the forms that I was just like, it's better to just create the common components, the reusable components, and then apply them to the form that I needed in. So reusable services as well were provided for each of the forms. And so validation services or anything like handling special use cases can be considered as well as a factory. They, like I said earlier before, factories and domain services can overlap depending on what you need from the services. And so these were when I kind of like started to kind of put everything together, map it all together, and try to figure it out. Although I have finished this specific project and refactoring everything from Angular to React, the way that I've built it naturally without knowing the approach, because our front-end architecture is already built that way, I just didn't put the name to a concept or put the approach to a concept yet. And so essentially, now that I have to do any more work on it, it is maintainable. I can eventually put all these three into one component, into a higher level component, and everything else, and then leverage all the reusable components that I already had. So any future work that I do on this is pretty easy to like add different functionality or add any future features. There isn't any confusion, and I've also provided documentation to how these different services and feature flag service that also works within our thing. And so it makes it a lot easier to add things in the future, even after I leave. The code is readable, it's maintainable. Yeah, this is what I felt like after creating that. So definitely it's something to look into before creating a project. But if you already have the concept in your head, it kind of makes it a little bit easier. And I think this approach is going to help me in the future when I have to refactor anything that's going to be a little bit complex and stuff. So I am done. Does anybody have any questions whatsoever? I think I finished really early today. Woo!